Welcome to 2026. Here we are now in the second quarter of the 21st century, and it looks like we are about to see a change in the global order. This is a huge, traumatic, anxiety-inducing, fearful, but also perhaps for many people exciting opportunity to remake the world. In particular, it's a time of opportunity for this generation. Since 1995, half of the world, half of today's world were born. So actually, only half of the world have any memory of the 20th century. It's quite an interesting tipping point that we're at the moment. In fact, if we go back to 1989, since 1989, when really the current world order was created, and we'll talk about that. If we go back to 1989, 65% of the world's population was born since that date. So when we talk about international relations, when we talk about the world order, you often hear from old men like me or old women about the 20th century world order, but actually we're living in a century where most people have no living memory of the 20th century. So those norms, those expectations, those perspectives that academics, political leaders and others, most of them like me in their 50s or 60s or 70s or approaching 80 like the President of the United States, these are people who come from another world from the one that is being created at the moment. And so in talking about the geopolitics of Asia, the place to start is to think about how we are in the process of finding ourselves in a new world order today, or perhaps in the coming years. It's not clear yet whether we are exactly at the point when we will look back in history and say it was 2026 when the new world order was created, but it certainly appears like we're close. It's starting to feel like we're close because the powers in the world are changing so dramatically. As we read the news every day, things are so dramatically different from the way they were in the past. Now, this has happened a number of times in the last century, that we have found ourselves at a point in time with a completely new world order from the one that the previous generation had known. Of course, we could go back centuries, but why don't we start, if we start with 1919, the Paris peace negotiations at the Palace of Versailles. A new world order was agreed by the major powers of the day. The major victorious powers of World War I drew lines on maps, determined who was in and who was out, where was the power going to reside. Some countries were cut down in size, some empires were given a new infusion of confidence, such as the Japanese Empire, for example. The Japanese occupation of Shandong in China was authorised by that treaty at Versailles. The old German colonial possession was to be handed to the Japanese, for example, and many other fundamentally important decisions were made at that point in time in 1919. People at the time probably imagining that they were reshaping a world order that would last for some time. The United States was the rising power at the time, and had President Wilson of the United States had an idealistic way of talking about a new world in which countries could find their self-determination and be independent. He wasn't thinking about most countries of the world. When he said that, he was thinking about countries of the Balkans, countries in Europe, but he certainly wasn't extending that to French Indochina, for example, or to British India. The concept of a new world of sovereign people was very much a European concept in 1919. So a century ago, we were in a European world. We were in a world of European empires. And even after that cataclysmic war, the worst war that the world had seen, the power of empire was simply redrawn in 1919. And it was as if those empires were going to last forever. Now, as we know, by 1945, a completely different world was brought into being. So it was a generation later, after the Depression, after the Second World War, after all of those changes that affected where Europe in particular, that had been so powerful, and those European empires that had ruled the world had taken what we might call a very serious beating. Europe was in an awful state, a sad state, and of course, who was the new rising power by 1945? Well, by 1945, the United States, on many measures, in particular manufacturing power, accounted for half the world's economy. The United States was producing 50% of the world's manufactures in 1945. Now, that was largely, of course, because of the destruction of the European economies in World War II, but even so, at a point in time when a new world order is created, what's very important to look at is who holds the cards, who has the economic power to determine the shape of that new world order. And it was very clear in 1945 that the victorious powers in World War II had the power to redraw the maps again. And of course, not only was there a supremely powerful United States, but there was also a victorious and powerful Soviet Union as well. And so, as we know, that redrawing of the map in 1945 set many things in stone, but also did not resolve many things. Because while a United Nations was formed, full of, again, ideals of a world of independent nations, while there was a new drive for decolonisation, for countries that were non-European countries to become independent and to take their seats at the United Nations. There was a new enthusiasm, US-led enthusiasm, around international law, international humanitarian law, and the idea that international relations somehow could be regulated. This was not always simply an idealistic notion, but it was a pragmatic response to two world wars. That actually it was better to try, even if you were going to fail, it was better to at least try to build a system of international relations based on respect for nations and for international law. However, as we know, it was only a couple of years after the United Nations was formed that any idealism was completely knocked on the head, disappeared, with the beginning of the Cold War, in which the United States and its allies, the Soviet Union and its emerging stronghold in Eastern Europe in particular, would be set against each other, and they set the tone for the next 4 decades. And so the 20th century, that people who lived through the 20th century, especially that second half of the 20th century, was overwhelmingly formed by that narrative, by that lived reality of a Cold War, a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. But it was differently experienced in different parts of the world. Here in Europe, it was called a Cold War because the line was drawn on a map. The power of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe was ruthlessly held. Even where people in Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia and other places tried to rebel against Soviet rule, they were put down with force. And the United States did not intervene because there was a line drawn on the map that throughout the Cold War was understood as a hard line, a hard separation between two spheres of influence. So forget about the idealistic United Nations. There was a pragmatic Cold War agreement, if you like, never written down in stone, but a Cold War acceptance that there were two spheres of influence. But in Asia, I must point out, it wasn't a Cold War. In Asia, this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union and China as well, which of course emerges as a power as well in that post-war period, this becomes a series of hot wars in Asia. So that new world order that was formed in 1945 that allowed theoretically the concept of self-determination, that Vietnam could be independent of France, that Indonesia could be independent of the Netherlands, that Korea could become an independent nation from Japan. These concepts took hold, and nationalism in that period, in the Cold War period, drove conflicts that became proxy wars of the Cold War. And so you have the United States and the Soviet Union fighting a proxy war in Vietnam. You have the United States and China fighting a proxy war in Korea. So that period, long ago as it might seem, but that formed the mentality, the thinking of the 20th century, that period of the Cold War, is fundamentally important, I would suggest, to understand how these world orders form and how they hold for a number of decades. That Cold War era seemed, and I'm old enough to remember it, I grew up in that era, it seemed like it was going to last forever. Nobody expected that the Cold War was suddenly going to end. All of the many analysts and intelligence experts of the United States, nobody expected the Soviet Union was just going to collapse. There was no expectation at all prior to the convulsion of people-led movements of the late 1980s against authoritarian rule that occurred in many different countries, but in particular, of course, the critical change was a change in leadership. And the change in leadership, which I'll talk about in relation to Asia, but in particular that change in leadership in the Soviet Union that led to the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, led to, inevitably led to the end of the Cold War, because Gorbachev as leader recognised that the Soviet Union was not able to continue as it had. It economically had to reform, as China had begun to do, but he also believed that the Soviet Union could politically reform, that the Soviet Union could become a less repressive and more sustainable system. Well, as we know, it all collapsed very quickly once the Soviet Union no longer enforced its control of Eastern Europe. Once it allowed Hungary and Poland to go, once it allowed the movement of people across that Hungarian border and did not stand in their way to allow East Germans and West Germans to meet across that Hungarian border, it was only a matter of weeks before the Berlin Wall fell. And 1989, the next seminal moment, the next critical moment in world history, and I want to suggest to you that we're approaching the next one soon. So it's worth looking back at 1989, I think, because 1989 was a moment that shook the world, just as those earlier changes in world order. 1989, the collapse of Soviet control in Eastern Europe, and by 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, changed the world completely again. Now, I mentioned that in 1945, the United States accounted for about 50% of the world economy, and the victors in the war accounted for about 70%. Well, in 1989, the non-socialist world was about 70 to 75% of the world economy. And so this again is an important point when we look at each of these inflection points, these turning points, these tipping points, when a new world order forms, you have to look at the economics, as well as the geopolitical power, as well as the leaders, as well as the cultural and political ideas of the time. You have to look at the raw economics. And so we'll be talking quite a bit about the economics, because 1989 was a fundamental assertion of the market economy. It was the victory, if you like, of the market economy. Sometimes it's misunderstood in the United States in particular, but perhaps sometimes in the rest of the West as well, as if the end of the Cold War was the victory of liberal democracy. Well, liberal democracies were certainly riding high in 1989, and it's certainly true that the liberal democracies were the best performing economies of the world, and it's certainly true that liberal democracies were very attractive to many of the reformers, the protesters around the world who were looking for more humane regimes. But I would suggest that the fundamentals of the change that occurred in 1989 were about the economics. The market economy simply demonstrated that it was much more efficient in distributing resources, in delivering a good life for its people. It wasn't perfect, still isn't perfect, but the market economy was something that people all over the world were embracing, that governments all over the world were realising could lead to better outcomes that would make more sustainable governance for themselves, would keep them in power, and would make for happier populations. And the big one that demonstrated this was, of course, the biggest of them all, China. In 1979 had begun its economic reform process, its process of opening up to the market economy to utilise as many levers, as many opportunities to use market mechanisms to bring productivity and growth into its economy as it could do, while still maintaining the party-state political system. So China adopting an approach to marketisation, not a pure market economy. I mean, arguably there are no pure market economies anywhere in the world. Every market economy has a large government share in the economy and a role for government in regulating and controlling. But certainly China was not endorsing a United States model, for example. But China, in adopting elements of the market economy, really demonstrated to the world the power of the market economy idea. And so the Soviet Union, 10 years later, in trying to go down the same path, was simply following that economic logic. Now, however, arguably, the political resilience, the political strength of the Soviet Union by the time of Gorbachev's perestroika, his opening up, his openness and transparency about the corruption and the problems in the system, led to the whole system collapsing. So 1989 is a much misunderstood turning point if we understand that it's all about the emergence of a universal liberal democratic model for governance. That, however, became a very popular narrative. It's a popular storyline that the United States used. The United States was very keen to claim victory in 1989, that it had won the Cold War. Somehow Gorbachev's actions were seen by the United States as a result of their battle with the Soviet Union over decades. And it's understandable why the Soviet Union why the United States wanted to imagine that it had won and defeated the Soviet Union. But in many respects, really, the Soviet Union was defeated by its own internal weakness and the deep opposition to Soviet rule by all of those countries that the Soviet Union was occupying across Eastern Europe. And I think we should not forget that importance of the China model, because by 1989, it was very clear that China was leading a marketisation experiment that was going to shake the world. And we now know that in 2026 we can talk about how that Chinese experiment in marketisation has indeed changed the world, and it's why we are approaching another tipping point because of the power of that idea, the globalisation that occurred from that post-1989 change. So the biggest change that occurred after 1989 was an economic globalisation. The supreme success of the market economy as the general idea, and each country with its own variation, but the supreme success of the market economy meant that it made sense for countries to be trading with each other and not to be just trading within their blocks. In the Cold War, we had a socialist bloc and we had a market economy bloc, and they didn't trade with each other very much at all. But since 1989, we have seen this globalisation where the concept of the market was embraced by elites, by businesses, and by governments across almost the entire world. And when we come to Asia, which of course from 1989 becomes more and more important to this global story, because while Asia had been colonised by European powers in the 19th century, had still been very much subject of empires in the early 20th century, but in that Cold War period, the countries of Asia had been becoming independent, they'd been developing themselves, and we'll come to the detail of what happened in those key Asian countries in the Cold War era. But by the 1989 turning point, the Asian economies were already fundamentally important to the global economy. Japan was already one of the major economies of the world. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea were demonstrating that market reforms could lead to significant, rapid, successful development. And so the process was beginning from 1989 that we're now starting to see the results of, but the process of the rise of Asia, where Asia by today, by 2026, is becoming the centre of the world economy. And therefore, if we look at the previous changes in world order, where the centre of the world economy had a major role in designing those world orders, therefore we might expect, based on the previous experience, we might expect that in the new world order, that it will be Asian powers that will play a particularly large role in designing what that new order might look like. And of course, the other reason why we might expect that is that it appears, when we look at the United States today, it appears that we are looking at almost like a reality TV soap opera, right? It's almost amusing to see the dysfunction, if it was not so deeply distressing to see the deep dysfunction and apparent, and I say apparent because it's not sure, but the apparent decline of the United States. The United States has been this enormously powerful country for the last century or more, and in particular in this last century. And so those of us who've grown up with a powerful United States have tended to, perhaps inappropriately, but have tended to link United States power with the power of the international system, governed by the United Nations, governed by international laws. We've all known that the United States, like all great powers, sometimes looks the other way and doesn't follow those international rules and laws. But we have observed since 1945 that the United States has been the main architect, the main author of those international laws, the architect of those international institutions. So for a long time now, the United States has been a key player in creating what has been known and as a level of stability, an expectation of some kind of stability and expectation that we understand the norms of the international system. Well, no more. It appears that the United States of today is one that is threatening what? We don't even know what, because every day it seems that Donald Trump wakes up and tweets something new. But is he seriously threatening to invade Greenland if he cannot buy it? We don't know if that's serious, but what we might guess is that that would be the end of NATO. That's a pretty fundamental change to the world order. What do we think Donald Trump really wants in Ukraine, for example? What do we think he really wants on the Korean Peninsula? What does he really want in relation to China? We don't really know. So the United States has become a relatively incoherent and ambiguous and confusing power, and yet it is militarily still the most powerful country on earth. We all assume, and we assume that because it has been so. But actually, of course, we now know the military power of China is very comparable in many ways. The growth of China's military capabilities has been stunning over the recent decades, simply by spending 2% of their GDP, their giant GDP, on building up their defence forces. China, simply through that slow but inexorable and inevitable growth, has become very competitive to the United States in many elements of power. Not in terms of projecting all around the world the way the United States does, with its hundreds of military bases, about 800 apparently. China has 2. So China doesn't have that global reach, but China does have a very powerful economy and a very powerful military. So when I say it appears that the US is still very powerful, we haven't really tested it. We haven't really seen a test of US power against a major power. The US hasn't been fighting in Ukraine. The US has been providing some material and some support, but it hasn't been directly fighting. We've seen the US interventions in Venezuela. That's pretty easy to do. Many countries could have done that. We've seen the US get bogged down in the Middle East. And before that, we saw the US get bogged down in Vietnam and Korea. In fact, all through those decades that I described, this relative stability of the Cold War, this belief that we had in the West in the power of the United States, the United States really hasn't actually won very many wars, not in any sort of sustainable way. And it's not clear what the United States under Donald Trump plans to do. Is Donald Trump wanting to go back to an imperial age? Does he have an imperial imagination that the United States will create an empire in the Americas that will intervene in countries in the Americas wherever it wants, which was a United States imagination of the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine. Trump now says he wants a Donroe Doctrine. He now wants his own new Monroe Doctrine of US power in the Americas. But his national security strategy that he just released a few weeks ago also indicates that the United States is going to want to contain China. It does not want China to be a hegemon in Asia, and it wants the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, for example. And so we might imagine that the United States still wants to play a balancing role in Asia. So as we approach this shakeout, this resolution of what a new world order looks like, we don't really know what the US role in all of that is going to be. And we don't really know either what stake, if any, Russia might have in the future world order, in particular in Asia. We don't really know, does Europe wish to play more of a geopolitical role, which has been suggested by Ursula von der Leyen and others, or does Europe inevitably perhaps return to being a multipolar collection of powers rather than one big power. And all of these are in flux. All of these are unknowns. But we tend to ignore Asia when we have these discussions. And so I want to suggest that as we approach the next 1989 or the next 1945, let's hope it's not another 1945 or 1919. Let's hope we don't have to have a war to resolve the next world order. But I want to suggest that the next world order is going to look like something totally unimaginable to us in the West. Because in the West, it has been Western powers, Western stories, Western narratives, Western imaginings of how the world should be. In the 19th century, as I said, it was European empires that determined how the world should be. In the 20th century, it was this great clash of European powers that determined how the world should be divided. In the 21st century, on many measures, China is already the largest economic power. It's by far the largest trading country on earth. Its economy on purchasing power parity terms, if we actually look at what people get for their yuan or for their dollar from their production, China is already comparable to the United States. Now, of course, its wealth per person is still a long way to go, but if we look at what's happened across the rest of Asia, we have a glimpse. We can have some idea of what the next world order is going to look like, because Japan in the post-war era completely recovered from World War II and became a major global economic player. Korea absolutely developed very successfully, became a major economic player. All of the smaller places that I mentioned before, Taiwan, Hong Kong, etc., demonstrated the power of development through embracing international trade, through having as much as possible free trade with the Asian region, with the United States, and as much as possible with the world. These places demonstrated they could develop. Those lessons of the 20th century from tiny places like Hong Kong and Singapore, they are now happening on a mass scale. So now the world's majority population in the developing world, places like China, places like India, places like Bangladesh, places like Indonesia, and of course beyond Asia as well, Brazil, Nigeria and other places. But I would suggest that Asia is the main game, because if you put all of those major Asian economies and populations together and you combine them with the smaller ones as well, but still important economies as well, that are still G20 economies, and that includes Australia and New Zealand, by the way, small in population, but significant economic players. If you look at the whole of Asia, you're looking even today at half the world economy. What's it going to look like if this new world order settles and Asia has a central role, and if Asia is able to stabilise its global supply chains and its access to global markets? What might that new world order look like in 10 or 20 years' time? I would suggest to you it's going to be Asian dominated. And I would suggest to you that's why I used the words fear and anxiety, because I think in the West there is a deep fear and anxiety about this, that a new world order is taking form, is growing in front of our eyes today, that is no longer going to be dominated by the West. Now, there might be pressures in the West today, and Donald Trump is the best example of this, against free trade, against the United Nations, against international treaties and international agreements, not to mention against action on climate change and other very important things. But in particular, if we're talking about the world economy, there is a populist reaction occurring, and it's occurring in this generation born since 1995, half of the world's population, but in the Western countries, in particular in the United States and here in Europe, young people are not convinced anymore about globalisation, about free trade, about the United Nations system and the World Trade Organization. This is causing anxiety to people that that system may benefit Asia more than it's going to benefit the countries of the West. The countries of the West are not likely to be in control any longer of the world economy. The IMF and the World Bank that were designed to lock in United States and European control of the world economy are no longer likely to be in control of the world economy in the next world order, I want to suggest. Now, I cannot prove this yet because we're in a period of change. And it could be that it's completely, the end result is completely different from what I'm forecasting today. No human has ever correctly forecast the future, so my forecasts may also be wrong. But I want to suggest that it is at least worth us thinking about the current process of change as being a process that is putting Asia at the centre of the new world order, at the centre of the economy, at the centre of the new geopolitical thinking, at the centre of the United Nations too, by the way, which again might be ignored by the United States at the moment. But if we look, which we will look in more detail later, if we look at what China and India and other countries are doing, they are deeply investing in the United Nations system. They're deeply investing in the World Trade Organization. They're deeply investing in having the security of the comfort of knowing that there's some stability in international trade agreements, in international relations, at a time of instability and dramatic change in the United States and elsewhere. So we are in a very interesting time. We are in a time, and you are all in a time, I think, where a new world order is going to take shape, where there are going to be contested ideas between East and West, where it's highly likely, it appears, that populist forces in the West are going to continue to have less confidence in the ideas of the late 20th century, the ideas of globalisation, the ideas of international law, the ideas that were kind of idealistic when we look back, because they were based on an idealism about universal values. And I want to suggest that when we're thinking about world order, we ought to be very careful not to believe our own rhetoric, our own idea that our one preferred system is going to dominate the world. That's old-fashioned thinking. That's 19th century thinking, in a sense, that an idea, an ideology can dominate large sections of the world. It was an idea that moved from European imperialism to Japanese imperialism to Soviet imperialism. We've had all these series of empires trying to impose their ideas. In a sense, the United States, in its different way, wanted to impose a sense of liberal democracy onto the world, but the United States has given up on that project. And I want to suggest that the rise of Asia indicates that so has much of the world. Much of the world is not looking to be told. They're not looking to be lectured. Countries of Asia, the people of Asia, are not looking to be given a model that they have to follow, that is a model of political system, an ideological way of thinking. What we have seen since the dramatic economic rise of Asia is a pragmatism. And we've seen a particularism. We've seen that particular countries are investing in their own national models. We're seeing that there's a much greater confidence in each of these countries of Asia in what they're doing in their own national specific circumstances. Now, this is something that I think France understands. France has always had a particular concept of itself and is not looking to be lectured by others. But much of the West was lectured for a long time by the dominant power of the West. And this created reaction, it created opposition. But even so, the post-1989 belief was in this liberal internationalism, this liberal idea that there was a universal set of values that the United States and the West stood for, and that the whole world was going to absorb all of these values and was going to model itself on the West. This reached its height with Francis Fukuyama when he wrote his book, The End of History. It was imagined in 1989 that really history had ended. And of course here in Europe, a period of history had ended. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe created a whole new circumstance that Europe needed to resolve, how to absorb those countries of Eastern Europe. And so an idea took hold. I'm going to suggest it was a pretty American idea. An idea took hold that a liberal Western notion could spread into Eastern Europe, and that the European Union could become rather like the United States. It could be a missionary for freedom and democracy that would ever expand, an ever-expanding idea of Europe. Now, I'm not here to criticise or to comment really on Europe, apart from to make that observation that here in Europe, people were thinking, many academics were thinking that there's an inevitability about the spread of liberal democracy. And in America, there was also, in the post-1989 period, a very strong belief that there was this inevitability about liberal democracy. It is not happening in Asia, where most of the world's population live. There is no growth of liberal, Western liberal democracy. There is the growth in many countries, relatively successfully and very successfully in some, of electoral democracies. And there are other states in Asia that are not and are not likely to be even electoral democracies, let alone liberal democracies. And the reason I say that is that these are countries that have their own cultures and their own political philosophies. You can't say to somebody in China who's grown up under Confucianism and Marxism-Leninism combined, you can't say to them that, oh, democracy would be a better system for you if you would adopt it in some kind of 1989 revolution. You can say it to some academics, as I have in China. I've asked the question, but mostly you will get the answer, wouldn't that lead to chaos? Mostly you get the answer in China, but that's not us. That's not our culture. Our culture is a hierarchical Confucian culture. We prefer order and stability. We prefer an elite to make the decisions, not for the masses to make the decision. If the masses were going to make the decision, we might make all the wrong decisions. This is the kind of answer you get, that I've had, because I've been visiting China for nearly 30 years, and I've been asking this question of many people. I'm simply interested to know, are people attracted by the idea of Western liberal democracy? And I haven't met many. I've met a few academics who've said, oh, yes, maybe one day. But it would take a huge cultural transition. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's not inevitable either, because these are different cultures and different civilizations that are prioritising different things from the priorities that we in Western countries might see and might imagine are universal. The phenomenal success of the economic development models in Asia mean that most young people of Asia know that they live a better life today than their ancestors have ever lived. So they're living in a period of optimism. Now, having said that, there have been some tough economic times the last few years, but as an overwhelming generalisation, Asia is in a period of massive economic growth and success, slowing down the last few years for sure, but still the path the likely trajectory, the future path for most Asian economies, the ones that have adopted market approaches and international trade, and that of course excludes places like North Korea and Myanmar, and we'll talk some more about those. But most of Asia, most of East Asia in particular, has embraced globalisation and free trade, industry development based on being deeply integrated into global supply chains, and the results speak for themselves. These economies have gone through the kind of fundamental growth that they're in the process, all of them that have adopted this strategy of moving from developing to developed economies, and some of them now already are of course amongst the most developed and richest societies on earth. So if this is the future path of the next 10 years, the next 20 years, the next 30 years, we might expect that those giant countries of Asia will be absolutely fundamentally central to the new world order.